This is a lecture for my 8th-hour class on the 10th of May. So America, look, Wilson, get all this down. Wilson and these progressives. I mean, didn't Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, didn't he want the United States to dominate the world? Yes, he did. He was an internationalist. Write that down. He wanted the United States, an internationalist. He wanted the United States to be involved all over the world. And so did Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson said it's our duty to go make the world safe for democracy, to spread democracy. If we're going to, he said in that speech, I didn't read the speech to you, but he said in that speech, he said, we are honored to spend our blood and our treasure to spread democracy all over the world. Well, that comes to a screeching halt after World War I. The American people say we were tricked into this war, and the American people now, get this down, become isolationists. In the 20s, we're talking about the 20s now. Isolationists. This is one of the great trends of the 20s. We're going to become isolationists. We're not going to go save anybody from anything. We're going to stay home and mind our own business. Donald Trump was elected in many ways. Well, one of the things that got him elected is that he talked about America first. Well, guess what? There's nothing new about that. In the 1920s, the Republicans said America first. We're going to take care of America first. Let the world go hang itself, okay? So there's a big fight between isolationism and internationalism, and which side won? Isolationists in the 1920s. But by the way, are we isolationists today? No, we're all over the globe. We probably talked about that yesterday, didn't we? We're all over the globe, right? Yes? Yeah. We got there's a model of the world right there. It's called the globe. You could spin that as fast as you could and blindfold yourself, and then all of a sudden, if I yell now, stick your finger and stop it, and anywhere you touched on that globe, the United States is involved. We're international. We're all over the globe today, but not the 1920s. The 1920s said, hey, we've had enough. We're going to come home. And in fact, that was the solemn referendum. Get that down. That was in the 1920 election. That is the solemn, what was called the solemn referendum. The word solemn, referendum. The word solemn means serious. A referendum is a question. In an election, especially what was the most serious question in the election of 1920? In an election, there are all sorts of questions. What are you going to do about taxes? What are you going to do about foreign affairs? What are you going to do about national defense? What are you going to do about abortion? What are you going to do? Crime, on and on and on and on and on. But usually an election comes down to one serious question that overrides all the others. And the solemn referendum, or the serious question, get this down, that overrode all the others, was this. Are we going to stay at home, or are we going to join the League of Nations? That's the big question. And how did the American people answer that in 1920? We're going to stay home. And we never did join the League of Nations. We're going to stay home. We never did join, we never did join the League of Nations. So isolationism won. And so thus began the Roaring Twenties, okay? Get this down. This began the Roaring Twenties. Thus began the Roaring Twenties. And the 1920s began with a great fear. Get this down, a great fear. What do you think people were afraid of? That's a broad opening question. But in 1920, what do you think what was the thing that had happened during World War I that just, terrified Americans? They were afraid it would happen here. We had a Spanish flu pandemic, but and of course, that certainly concerned people. That killed thousands of Americans. We just went through a pandemic. If any generation of American students that I've taught in my career ought to understand how that felt coming out of the Spanish flu, and how unsettled and how everything in America had changed in 1920, it ought to be you, because you're going through the same process right now. The COVID has changed everything. And I mean, it's changed everything. It's hard to get a car today. It's completely turned education upside down, all the way from kindergarten to the university. Yeah. So, and we're concerned about that. The Americans are apprehensive and maybe a little worried about that. Well, that's the same way people felt in the 1920s. Different pandemic. It was the Spanish flu. But it killed a lot more people than the COVID has so far. Okay, so you ought to understand how apprehensive and worried and nervous people were. But it wasn't that. What was the thing that happened in World War I that really upset Americans and had them worried and scared, and they thought that it might spread here?
War.
What?
War.
Well, I don't think they worried about a war occurring here in the United States. Think about the events that happened in World War I.
An invasion.
Well, an invasion of what? Excellent. Write that down, because what had happened. Very good, Mr. Mills. What had happened during World War I? Russia became communist, the Russian Revolution. And remember, communism was established by Karl Marx 50 years before. But what did Karl Marx predict? That the whole world would become communist. That workers all over the world would rise up and destroy democracy and destroy republics and destroy capitalism, and the whole world would become communist, okay? And you know, Karl Marx had predicted that 50 years before it happened. When people read Karl Marx's book before that happened, they looked at it and said, yeah, you know, that was Karl Marx's theory. But in World War I, theory turned to fact. It actually happened. And the American people were scared to death that that was the beginning of the world communist revolution. And you're right, an invasion, that the communists were going to come. And by the way, were there communists in America in 1920? Yes. Were there socialists in America? Yes. Were there anarchists who said we ought to just do away with it? Yes, there were in the 1920s. And people said, the time has come. The communist revolution is going to take over America. And people were afraid. And this is called the 1920s. Get this down. It begins with a thing called the First Great Red Scare. If there's a first Great Red Scare, there's going to be a second Great Red Scare. That happens after World War II. Essentially, both of the world wars the United States has participated in ended with a Great Red Scare. And here's what the Red Scare is. Get this down. Here's what it is. We're going to find the communists. Communists are a threat. Let me ask you this. Do you have the right to be a Republican? Do you have the right to be a Democrat? Do you have the right to be a communist? Wait a minute. No, you got the right to be a communist? Yes, you do. You know, if somebody can say, nope, can't be a communist, they can tell me I can't be a Republican. But when people were afraid of communism, the idea is we're going to round up, get this down, we're going to round up all these communists. We're going to get rid of them. We're going to put them in prison, not prison. We're going to put them in prison, and we're going to throw them out of the country. That's what we're going to do to protect America from these communists. And get this down. Because of that, now listen to what I'm going to say to you. Because of that, a lot of Americans were persecuted by the government. Get that down. They're going to be persecuted and by persecuted, I mean this. They're going to have their rights taken away. What sorts of rights do you think were taken away during the Red Scare?
Freedom of speech.
What?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of bear arms.
What?
Right to bear arms.
Well, I don't think they did that. I don't think, in certain groups, I guess they couldn't.
What about
Freedom of
voting?
press.
What?
Freedom of
Freedom of the
press.
press. They're going to shut down communist newspapers. They're going to shut down socialist newspapers, anarchist news. It's just a carryover from World War I, isn't it? Yeah, yes.
What about voting?
Nah,
Were they able to?
they may have. Certain groups might have been denied the right to vote. People are going to be lynched and murdered because of their, and I'm going to give you specific examples, because of what they believe politically. And of course, there's a great fear of all things foreign. Get this down. And here's the new word for you. Maybe you might already know this: xenophobia. Write that down. Xenophobia runs rampant in this country. Xenophobia, that's fear of all things foreign. So what do people want to stop? What's this fear of all things foreign sweeps over the country? What do people want to stop?
Anything foreign?
What?
Anything foreign?
Yes. What specific thing? Yeah, you're right. What specific thing do they want to shut down in America in the 1920s? And they're going to do it. Huh?
Immigration.
I didn't hear you.
Immigration.
Immigration, right there. Yeah, very good. You know what? For the first time in the 1920s, the U.S. government restricted immigration. They said no more immigrants. This country began in 1789. From 1789 to 1924, People came here from all over the world for all sorts of reasons. Today, we've got a term called undocumented immigrants. If you're living in America and you're not a citizen, you're undocumented. You know what most undocumented immigrants are? They're people who came here and got a work visa. If I wanted to go over and teach in Germany, and I don't, but if I wanted to go over and teach in Germany, I'd have to get a visa to stay there and teach. And it's just like a driver's license. Every so often, I'd have to go get my visa renewed. You know, most of the undocumented immigrants in this country today, most of them, they're just people who, forgot to get their visa renewed. They go get their visa renewed, they're not undocumented anymore. That's half of the so-called undocumented immigrants. By the way, the government says we're going to shut down immigration because who knows who's coming into America in 1921? Who knows? There may be communists sneaking into America that will start a revolution. What are people saying about immigration right now in this country? Who knows who's coming there? Who knows? Terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS are using immigration to sneak into America, and they may kill Americans. So a lot of people say we've got to stop immigration today. There are 150,000 asylum seekers. You know what an asylum seeker is? It's someone who's being persecuted in their country, and they go to another country. We're not the only country by far. They go to another country to save their lives. Okay, well, there are 150,000 people down at the border, and many of them are asylum seekers. But some people say that's just a cover for what they really are. Many of them are terrorists who want to get in America and do real harm. So we've got to build a wall, or we've got to stop immigrants from coming to America. I point that out to you because it's the same feeling. Just think about the similarities we have. We're in the 2020s. Think about the similarities we have with the 1920s, just coming out of a pandemic, an immigration crisis. All that was happening 100 years ago in this country. And of course, it's going to be very influential in starting this first Great Red Scare. We're worried about terrorist groups coming into the country. They were worried about a terrorist group called communists coming into the country. Also, get this down. There's a bombing campaign in the 1920s. There are terrorist groups in America in the 1920s. Some communists are terrorists. Some anarchists are terrorists. They start sending bombs to members of the Supreme Court. They start sending bombs to the attorney general, senators, governors. There were 50 bombings in this country in the early 1920s. By the way, there's no radio, there's no television. No radio, no television. Where do people get their news? Newspapers. Imagine somebody in Eufaula, Oklahoma in 1922 picking up their newspaper and reading that a bomb had been set off on Wall Street. What if we heard right now? They came over the intercom and said, we just want to inform you that the Chase Manhattan Bank, which is one of the biggest banks in the world, it may be the biggest one, and it sits on Wall Street, blew up and 50 people were killed there just now. What would be the first word that crossed our mind? Terrorists. That's exactly right. Well, when these bombs start going off in the 1920s, what's the first word that crosses their mind? Communist. This is the beginning of the communist revolution in people's minds. I think the similarities between this generation of the 1920s and our generation is absolutely striking. Also, get this down. There were labor strikes. Working men went on strike all over America. Working men went on strike. By the way, why did they all go on strike by 1920? What were they striking for?
More pay.
More pay. So why all of a sudden, just everywhere, you can't get a bus in Chicago because all the bus drivers are on strike. You can't get a newspaper in New York because all the printing presses and newspaper offices are shut down. All the newspaper people.
They couldn't strike during World War I.
They couldn't strike in World War I. Excellent. They couldn't strike in World War I. But wait a minute. What else couldn't working people have during World War I?
More pay.
More pay. So you know what? The war's over. And these working men said, hey, we and our families sacrificed for a year. You wouldn't give us a pay raise. We want the pay raise now. And every morning when you picked up your newspaper, wake up. Every morning when you picked up your newspaper, there was somebody else on strike somewhere. In the big cities, mainly. And what do Americans reading their newspapers in Little Eufaula, Oklahoma think that's the beginning of? Yeah, where did the communist revolution start in Russia? Not in the country, it started in the big cities. Who led that revolution? Workers. Workers on strike. They were striking for food, but they were on strike. And of course, those similarities chilled a lot of Americans to the bone. They said, we can't believe that this is happening in our country. In addition to that, get this down, all those things are happening. In addition to that, there was a great migration in America. There was a great migration. Black people, get this down. Black people, African Americans. In the South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, places like that, black people in the South many of them wanted to leave the South. They wanted to leave the lynching and the Ku Klux Klan and the segregation and the racism in the South. A lot of them said, we'll go north and we'll get a job in the factory. There are factory jobs, and we will better our lives and the lives of our families. And so they went north. Get this down. They went to places like Chicago, Detroit. They went north. And when they got north, what did they discover?
It wasn't that good.
I'm sorry?
It wasn't that
There was
good.
racism there too, right? There was racism. Maybe not quite as strong in the South, but there was racism there. There was racism there too. And of course, in the 1920s, get this down. You want to know what the 20s are like? Bombing, strikes, the fear of communism. Well, guess what? In the 1920s, it's a great period of racial violence. In fact, I'm going to talk to you about this tomorrow probably, but in 1921, about an hour and a half, maybe just an hour from where you're sitting, in 1921, the biggest race riot in the history of America. It's still the biggest. It was 100, what is this, 23? It was 102 years ago. It's still the biggest race riot. The worst race riot in American history happened about an hour from where you're sitting in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm going to tell you all about that. We've mentioned it before, but I'm going to go into detail and tell you all about it. But it's the 20s, you need to understand, is a period of racial hatred and racial conflict. And let me just give you a quick example. A lot of these African Americans went north. A lot of them went to Chicago. You know, it's at the end, at the south end of one of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, one of the chief attractions in Chicago. They have these beautiful, pristine beaches, and there are millions of people who live in Chicago. They go out and lie on the beach and play games and do everything you do out down here at the Cove, except on a grander scale. And that beach was strictly segregated, and the line ran right out into the water. This was the black section. This was the white section. And early in the 1920s, I want to say it was 1921 or 22. Don't hold me to that. I need to look that up. But there were a group of black teenagers here in the waters, like people do. They get out of the water and play games and throw balls and splash and play. And a 17-year-old boy wasn't paying close attention. I mean, it's not like there was a rope out in the water dividing it, but he wasn't paying close attention. And he happened to drift over to the white section of the lake. And a group of whites on shore, just think about this. You want to know what America was like in the 1920s. A group of whites on shore saw him floating over into the, quote, white section. They didn't call the police. They didn't yell, hey, get out of here. They ran and got stones, and they stoned him to death. Okay. And this led to the outbreak of a race riot in Chicago that lasted 8 days, blacks and whites killing each other. And when it was all over, hundreds were injured and 50 were killed, okay? 50 were killed. The fact is, if you were not a native-born white American, you were suspect. You were suspect. And get this down, thousands of people in the 20s feel threatened. They say these alien forces are going to destroy America. We have to defend America. And which organization did they join? And I know that's a broad, open-ended question, but which organization did they join to defend America?
KKK.
Very good. Write that down. The Ku Klux Klan. I want you to write this down about the Ku Klux Klan. The 1920s was the greatest period for membership. In other words, let me put it this way. More Americans joined the Klan in the 1920s than any other time in history. You know, when the 20s started, before this great fear swept across America, there were about 5,000 people in the Klan. By the middle of the 1920s, by 1925, get this down, there were 5 million. There were more Americans in the Klan than ever before in our history, and more than there would ever be before. 5 million people in the Klan. 5 million. By the way, which state do you think had? Let me tell you this about that. It ran, to a large degree, the Ku Klux Klan ran Oklahoma. Now, the state legislature over in Oklahoma City, the majority of members in the state legislature were probably members of the Ku Klux Klan. It was everywhere in this state. Which state do you think, though, had the most Klansmen in it? There's some Klan chicks, ladies. Klan. There's a Klan horse. I feel sorry for that horse. He didn't have a choice. And there's his owner, I guess, in a hood. I guess, you know, when he had to raise his hoof to take the oath. Anyway, the Klan always carries two things: the Bible and the American flag. If there's anything that is antithetical to both those things, it's the Klan that they carry those, okay? There's a Klan initiation. They're all kneeling down, taking the oath, and there's a burning cross. And there is 250,000 Klansmen marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. Think about that, in the nation's capital. 250,000 march through Washington, D.C. That's the capital of the United States. That's the dome right there. And they are marching. They're marching by in this parade. They march right by the White House to show their strength. By the way, how many Klansmen do you think there are in America today? They're still around. They've got their own website. How many Klansmen do you think there are in America today?
20,000.
How much?
20,000.
That's 10. About 10,000. Not 10 Klansmen, about 10,000, okay? And they're a terrorist group. They still kill people. If we heard a report tomorrow that there were 10,000 members of ISIS in the United States, this country would be in an uproar, but I guess we've learned to live with the Klan. We think we have. 10,000, okay? 10,000 Klansmen. Which state, by the way, so the 1920s is the heyday of the Klan. Which state do you think had the most Klan members?
Alabama.
That's an educated guess, but that's not it.
Virginia.
Nope.
Georgia.
Georgia? Nope.
Oklahoma.
Nope. We have a lot.
Tennessee.
Huh?
Tennessee.
Nope. South Carolina? Nope. North Carolina? Nope.
Texas.
Nope. Indiana. What's odd about that? We wouldn't have thought about that. What's odd about Indiana?
It's up and
It's a northern state. We associate the Klan with the South, but this is what I want you to get down. This is what I want you to get down on that. It's everywhere. It wasn't just in the South anymore, it's everywhere. Well, to many Americans then, as the 20s began, nothing in this country seemed right, okay? There was just something literally wrong with the United States of America. And in the midst of all of this uneasiness and apprehension and fear came the Boston police strike. Write that down, the Boston police strike. And when you get the Boston police strike written down, everybody get up and take a break real quick, because I've only got a few minutes to do a lot of things. So quickly, get up and stretch. Is it hot in here, you all?
Just a little.
Huh?
Just a little.
This for me. All right. The Boston police strike. Where's Boston? It's the capital city of what?
Massachusetts.
Write that down, Massachusetts. M-A-S-S period. NASA. By the way, sound out words. Massachusetts. Massachusetts. Anyway, Boston. Boston, Massachusetts. And in 1919, the police in Boston went on strike. The reason they went on strike is because they wanted a pay raise. They hadn't had a pay raise in over a year. The city council in Boston was so chintzy, so tight, that the Boston policemen had to buy their own bullets. The city wouldn't even buy bullets for them, okay? And so they went on strike in September of 1919. This is a little bit before the 1920s, but it sort of sets the tone for the 1920s. They went on strike. What happened was they went to the city, and the city said no. So out of the 1,544 cops in Boston, 1,100 of them called in sick. What would happen in Tulsa tomorrow? Three-fourths of the, almost all the policemen called in sick, and there were no policemen on duty in Tulsa tomorrow.
A crime.
The criminals would take over. And get this down, that's exactly what happened in Boston. Banks were robbed, citizens were assaulted in broad daylight, businesses were robbed, criminals broke into homes and beat up the homeowner and took whatever they wanted. And of course, if you were reading about that and you follow Oklahoma in your newspaper, and a lot of people were worried, and they said, my God, this is the beginning, it's a big city, there's a strike, the criminals are overrunning the city, and what did people believe that this might be the beginning of again? Communist revolution, get this down. And the American people are fearful, they're watching things spinning out of control in Boston. And they're looking to see if someone will come forward to save the day, and no one is taking charge. Enter into the picture this guy on the board, write him down, Calvin Coolidge. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and he took charge. Get this down. First thing he did, get this all down, first thing that Coolidge did was he declared martial law. What is martial law? Where the military what? Takes over a city or a state or a county. Martial law. A few years ago, we had a tornado that blew away most of Moore. And before the tornado had gone back up in the clouds, there were all these thugs coming out there, breaking into the houses and taking away televisions while the family was gone and away in the cellar. Until the governor of Oklahoma declared martial law. He sent the Oklahoma National Guard down there. A few years ago, we had a hurricane called Hurricane Katrina that sunk the Fourth of New Orleans. And before the wind had stopped blowing, a bunch of thugs were down there stealing everything until the governor of Louisiana declared martial law. Well, that's what Calvin Coolidge said, and I don't know what time frame he used, but he said, if you're on the street after a certain time, what's going to happen to you? You're going to get arrested, and you may get what? Shot. That's exactly right. So he takes over. And then, get this down, he says to the police of Boston, listen, these striking policemen, he said, if you're not back at work on Monday, what? You're fired. Most of them came back, but some didn't. And what happened to them? They were fired. What did Coolidge do to the strike?
He broke it.
He broke it. Write that down. He ended the strike. You with me? Yes?
Wait, who ended it?
What? Coolidge, he did, the governor. He's calling out the National Guard. He's declaring martial law. He's the guy telling them, if you're not back at work, you're fired. All right? And of course, he was criticized for that. People said, hey, I'm going to test your knowledge here. People said, hey, workers have the right to strike. They have a right to strike. You're wrong, Governor. And here's Coolidge's reply. I want you to write it down. Coolidge said, yeah, they got the right to strike. But, there's always a but. But, there is no right, look at that, there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. End quote. Yeah, you got the right to strike until your strike endangers the country. And then what can happen? That right can be taken away or restricted. What does this remind you of? Have you heard something like this before? What does it remind you of? Yeah, you've got free speech, but you can't, shank. Very good. You've got free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and endanger everyone watching the movie. Yeah, your speech can be taken away. If your speech presents you remember, a clear and present danger. That's the same thing Coolidge is saying a few years later. And guess what? Just keep right on writing. Very good. You passed the test of your, look, that's in 1919. The next year is the presidential election in 1920. Are people worried and fearful in this country in 1920?
Yes.
Do they want somebody to stand up and take control?
Yes.
Well, the Republicans in 1920 nominate a man named Warren Harding for president. But they need a vice presidential candidate. And who do they nominate? Calvin Coolidge. They nominate Coolidge. Don't call these people by their first name. Yeah, they nominate either Coolidge or Calvin Coolidge. How did he get what gave him that nomination?
Standing up against the Boston.
The Boston police strike. The way he handled the Boston police strike. Let me ask you something. Could you say that the Boston police strike, listen to what I'm going to say, the Boston police strike was Calvin Coolidge's San Juan Hill moment? Did you say that?
Yes.
Go back. 1898. San Juan Hill. TR. 1900. War hero. He's nominated as vice president. 1901. McKinley is shot and TR becomes president. What put him in the White House? San Juan Hill. 1919. The Boston police strike. Calvin Coolidge makes a name for himself. He's nominated as vice president in 1920, and he wins. And by 1923, Warren Harding is dead. And who's the president of the United States? What put him in the White House? The Boston police strike. Is that his San Juan Hill moment? It sure is. Yeah, you see how that works? It sure is. And by the way, put a big star by Coolidge's name because he's the president of the United States for most of the 1920s. And get this down, he's very conservative. When Coolidge steps in the White House, the progressive era is as dead as a doornail. Coolidge is very conservative. He's president of the United States from 1923 until 1929. Most of the Roaring Twenties, Calvin, and we're going to talk a lot more about it, but Calvin Coolidge is president of the United States for most of the 1920s. He's very good. Listen, the ascension of Calvin Coolidge to the White House signifies the end of the progressive movement. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime, anywhere. Okay. Well, so the 20s was a period of great intoleration. Okay. The 20s, 1920s, is a period of great intoleration. Even those, people, look, if you were a minority, if you were a Roman, well, all right, well, write this down. This is where we'll start tomorrow. Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti. Take it up there, come tomorrow.
Well, if you don't buy a dog, you don't mind.
You take good care of that dog.
I'm on this dog. I'm on this dog. You want to see my dog?
Joking.
Run.